Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile gap that could break the world. Every single morning, before your alarm goes off, before the first cup of coffee, before the global economy has done a single transaction, a quiet, unremarkable fleet of ships is moving through a strip of water barely 33 kilometers wide. That's shorter than a marathon. You could drive across it in 20 minutes, yet it holds the world's pulse in its hands. You've never seen these ships. Most people never will. They don't look dramatic. They're enormous, slow, rust-streaked tankers riding low in the water under the weight of what they carry. But what they're carrying is the reason your electricity works, the reason your car starts, the reason supermarket shelves stay stocked, the reason every global supply chain continues to function. They're carrying oil, the 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply, moving through a gap between two coastlines so narrow that in certain shipping lanes you could theoretically see the land on both sides simultaneously. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and if it closes, even for a week, the global economy doesn't just slow down, it seizes. Imagine this. Oil prices double overnight. Aviation fuel becomes so expensive that airlines ground their fleets. Petrol stations run dry within days. The countries of Europe and Asia, which import almost all of their energy, begin emergency rationing. The stock markets of New York, London, Tokyo, and Shanghai go into freefall. All of it because of a narrow body of water that most people couldn't find on a map. But here's the thing about the Strait of Hormuz that the news never quite captures. This is not a news story. This is not a product of the oil age or the Cold War or the tensions between Iran and the West. This strait has been the most strategically important corridor of water on Earth for 5,000 years. Empires have risen and fallen fighting over it. The world's greatest naval powers have stationed their fleets in its approaches, and the specific combination of geography, resources, and political instability that makes it dangerous today is the same combination that made it dangerous for the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Portuguese, and the British before us. So, how did 33 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman become the most dangerous choke point on the planet? Let's go back to the beginning. Pull up a map of the Middle East and look at the bottom right corner. You'll see a body of water called the Persian Gulf, technically also called the Arabian Gulf, depending on who you're asking, a dispute we'll get to, stretching roughly 990 kilometers from northwest to southeast. It's surrounded by some of the most oil-rich territory on Earth: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE. Now trace the Gulf toward its southeastern end. Watch what happens to the coastlines. They squeeze together. The land on the north, that's Iran. The land on the south, that's the tip of the Oman Peninsula, with the UAE just behind it. And between them, at the narrowest point, is the Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers wide at its tightest. To put that in perspective, the English Channel at its narrowest point is 34 kilometers. The Strait of Gibraltar is 14 kilometers. But in terms of strategic importance, the Strait of Hormuz dwarfs both of them combined. Here's why the geography matters so specifically. The Persian Gulf has exactly one exit. One. Every ship that enters the Gulf to load oil must leave through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no back door, no alternative route, no canal you can take instead. If the strait closes, the Gulf becomes a cul-de-sac, and the oil trapped inside it goes nowhere. Now, within the strait itself, the shipping lanes are even more constrained than the overall width suggests. International maritime law establishes two main shipping lanes, one for inbound vessels, one for outbound, each approximately 3 kilometers wide, separated by a 3-kilometer buffer zone. 3 kilometers, that's the actual corridor through which the world's energy supply moves. These lanes hug the Omani side of the strait, the southern shore, because the Omani and UAE coastline offers deeper water and clearer approaches. The Iranian coastline to the north is shallower and more complex, but what this means in practice is that the outbound shipping lane, carrying fully loaded supertankers heavy with oil, passes within visual range of the Iranian coast and within easy range of Iranian coastal defense systems. That geographic fact is not an accident. It is the source of Iran's leverage over global energy markets, and it is the reason that the strait has been a flashpoint in every major regional conflict of the past century. The concept of a choke point needs a moment of explanation because it's the key to understanding why this particular piece of water matters so disproportionately. A choke point is any geographic feature that funnels maritime traffic into a narrow, constrained corridor. The world has several strategically important ones: the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb at the southern entrance to the Red Sea. But choke points are not all equal. Their strategic significance depends on 3 factors: how much traffic passes through, how difficult the traffic is to reroute, and how vulnerable the corridor is to disruption. On all 3 measures, Hormuz is in a category of its own. The traffic figure is the one that stops people cold. On a typical day, between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil and liquid natural gas pass through the strait. To put that in context, global daily oil consumption is approximately 100 million barrels. So roughly 1/5 of all the oil the world uses every day has to pass through this single point, including up to 80% of all the oil exported by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran, including virtually all the LNG exported by Qatar, which is the world's largest LNG exporter. The rerouting problem is brutal. In theory, some of this oil could bypass Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline, the Petroline, running from the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE has a pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, but these pipelines have a combined capacity of approximately 6.5 million barrels per day, a fraction of the 17 to 21 million that normally flows through the strait. There is no scenario in which overland pipelines replace the Strait of Hormuz. The gap between capacity and demand is simply too large, and the vulnerability to disruption. We'll spend the rest of this video on that. But first, to understand why Hormuz became what it is, we need to go back 5,000 years to when this piece of water first began to shape the world. Here's something the news cycle rarely tells you. The Strait of Hormuz was a major trade route 3,000 years before anyone drilled the first oil well. Cast your mind back to roughly 3000 BC. The Mesopotamian civilizations, Sumer, then Akkad, then Babylon, are the most sophisticated societies on Earth, concentrated in the river valleys of what is now Iraq. They need copper, timber, semi-precious stones, and textiles. And they know these things exist to the southeast, in the Indus Valley civilization of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, and in the ancient culture of Dilmun, which occupied modern Bahrain and the eastern Arabian Peninsula. To connect these trade networks, merchants needed to navigate the Persian Gulf, which means they needed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Sumerians called the Gulf their lower sea, as distinguished from the Mediterranean, which they called the Upper Sea. Cuneiform tablets from the 3rd millennium BC describe merchant voyages down the Gulf, through the strait, and into the open Arabian Sea beyond, trading grain, textiles, and finished goods for the copper of Oman, which ancient sources called Megan, and the goods of Meluha, probably the Indus Valley. Hormuz wasn't just a passage, but it was the pivot point of the ancient world's first genuinely long-distance maritime trade system, connecting civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers in an era of ox carts and sailing ships. Fast forward to the 6th century BC and the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the First Persian Empire, under kings like Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and Xerxes. This empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt and the Aegean coast in the west to the borders of India in the east, and it understood, with sophisticated political intelligence, that the Strait of Hormuz was the valve that controlled the economic output of its richest eastern provinces. Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 BC, and who is generally regarded as the greatest administrator in the ancient world, specifically organized Persian naval capacity in the Gulf to protect and control its trade routes. He sent a naval expedition under the Greek commander Scylax to explore the Indus River and its coastline, mapping the sea routes that connected the Persian Gulf to India through Hormuz. He built roads, administrative centers, and trading posts along the Gulf coast. The Persian Gulf under the Achaemenid Empire was not just a waterway, it was a managed commercial system, with the strait as its gateway and Persian naval power as its guardian. The goods flowing through that gateway were extraordinary by ancient standards. Pearls from the Gulf itself, the Persian Gulf, pearl fisheries were among the most productive in the world, and Gulf pearls were luxury commodities in Rome, India, and China simultaneously. Spices from the Indian Ocean trade, cardamom, pepper, cinnamon, reaching Persia and the Mediterranean through Hormuz, frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula, fine textiles from India, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from the African coast. The Strait of Hormuz was, in economic terms, the drain through which the wealth of the Indian Ocean world flowed into the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern market. Control the strait, control the flow of that wealth. It was as simple and as violent as that. When Alexander the Great destroyed the Achaemenid Empire in 331 BC, one of his specific strategic objectives was exactly this: to control the Persian Gulf trade route. His admiral Nearchus led a naval expedition from the mouth of the Indus River back to the Persian Gulf in 325 BC, the most ambitious open-sea voyage by a Greek fleet to that point. Nearchus was specifically scouting the Hormuz Passage and the Gulf coast to assess their commercial and military potential. Alexander died before he could act on what Nearchus found. But the Seleucid Empire that succeeded him in Persia maintained active naval operations in the Gulf and through the Strait, understanding that the eastern trade was the engine of the regional economy. By the Roman period, the Strait of Hormuz had a name. The strait was referenced in Ptolemy's 2nd century AD geography as the passage between the Persian Sea and the outer ocean. On Roman merchants, working through Nabatean and Parthian intermediaries, were receiving Indian and East Asian goods that had passed through Hormuz. The Roman Empire's insatiable appetite for pepper, silk, and spices was fed in part by trade routes that ran through this narrow gap. The Roman Emperor Augustus even sent diplomatic missions to the kings of southern Arabia, in part to secure the trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Strait of Hormuz was, to Rome, the far end of the supply chain that kept Roman luxury markets supplied. It was not yet a flashpoint, but the strategic logic was already established. 5,000 years ago, humans understood that whoever controlled the narrow passage at the end of the Persian Gulf controlled the commerce of two oceans. The rise of Islam in the 7th century AD didn't just transform religion, it transformed global commerce. Under the Umayyad and then the Abbasid caliphates, the Arab world became the most sophisticated commercial civilization on earth. Arab and Persian merchants, often working together, often overlapping in culture and intermarrying, developed trade networks of extraordinary range. They sailed regularly from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz to India, to the ports of East Africa, to the coasts of Southeast Asia, and eventually to China. The city of Siraf, on the Iranian coast of the Persian Gulf, became one of the great ports of the early medieval world. A city of merchants whose goods included Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, African ivory, and the spices of the Spice Islands. Ships from Siraf and from Basra, at the head of the Gulf, made the Strait of Hormuz one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world between the 8th and 10th centuries A.D. The Arab navigator Ibn Majid, a 15th century figure, but drawing on centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge, wrote detailed pilot books describing the Strait of Hormuz, its currents, its shoals, its seasonal winds, and the timing of the monsoon that governed Indian Ocean sailing. His work represents the codification of centuries of Arab maritime expertise centered on this passage. And then there was the city of Hormuz itself. The city of Hormuz, or more precisely, Old Hormuz, on the Iranian mainland, and later New Hormuz, on the island of Jarun, which we now call Hormuz Island, was one of the great medieval entrepôts. At its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries, the city of Hormuz was among the wealthiest ports in the world. Marco Polo, passing through in the 1270s, described it as a place of extraordinary commercial activity, full of merchants from India, Persia, Arabia, and East Africa. He noted that the heat was so extreme in summer that the inhabitants retreated underground, and that the wind off the sea was so hot it could kill a man caught in the open. But the money was good enough to endure even that. Marco Polo described Hormuz harbor filled with ships from every direction, the visual image of a genuinely globalized medieval trade network, all converging on this single narrow passage. The great 14th century Arab traveler Ibn Battuta visited Hormuz in 1327 and in 1332, describing it in similar terms: a prosperous city, a busy harbor, a place where the world's merchants met. Ibn Battuta, who traveled more widely than virtually any person of his era, recognized Hormuz as one of the truly critical nodes of the global trading system. The economic goods flowing through Hormuz in the medieval Islamic era were different from those of antiquity, but the logic was the same. Spices, textiles, porcelain, pearls, horses, an important export from Arabia to India, where cavalry was valued and horse breeding was difficult, and increasingly, luxury goods of every description. The Islamic civilizations of this era were sophisticated consumers as well as producers. The courts of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo, and the various Persian and Central Asian dynasties all demanded the goods that the Indian Ocean trade provided. And all of that trade passed through Hormuz. The strait was also, in this era, a political boundary and a source of revenue. The rulers who controlled Hormuz, whether Persian emirs, local Arab dynasties, or representatives of larger regional powers, collected taxes on every vessel that passed. The revenue was enormous. The city of Hormuz, in its medieval peak, was essentially a toll booth at the end of the world's most productive commercial highway, and its rulers became extraordinarily wealthy on that basis. Sound familiar? The economic logic of Hormuz, the choke point that generates revenue for whoever controls it, has been consistent for 5,000 years. Only the methods of control and the nature of the goods have changed. The year is 1507. A Portuguese fleet commanded by Afonso de Albuquerque arrives at the island of Hormuz. Albuquerque is not there to trade, he is there to conquer. And he is the instrument of a Portuguese strategic vision that had been developing for decades, to break the Arab and Venetian monopoly on the Indian Ocean spice trade by establishing direct maritime control of the route from Europe around Africa to the east. And the Strait of Hormuz, which Albuquerque correctly identified as the valve controlling the entire Persian Gulf trade network, is exactly the kind of choke point that the Portuguese strategy required. Albuquerque's first attempt to take Hormuz failed. A combination of local resistance, disease, and a mutiny among his own officers forced him to withdraw. But he came back. In 1515, Albuquerque returned with a stronger force, captured the island and the city, and began construction of the fort that would make Portuguese control of the strait permanent. The Fort of Our Lady of the Conception, known in Arabic as Calat al-Burtugal, the Portuguese fort. The ruins of that fort still stand on the island of Hormuz today. You can visit them. They are exactly what you'd expect from a 16th-century Portuguese military installation, massive coral stone walls designed to withstand cannon fire, positioned to command the harbor and the strait approach. And they represent something important. The first time a European power had physically seized and fortified the most important maritime choke point outside European waters. For over a century, Portugal controlled the Strait of Hormuz and collected tolls on the trade that passed through it, using the same economic logic that the medieval Arab dynasties of Hormuz had developed, but now enforced by European naval technology. The impact on the established trade networks was significant. Arab and Persian merchants who had dominated the Indian Ocean trade for centuries found themselves paying duties to Portuguese officials or risking having their ships seized. The great trading families of the Gulf had to adapt. Some collaborated, some resisted, some moved their operations to routes that avoided Portuguese control. But Portuguese dominance was never absolute. The Ottomans, who had conquered Egypt in 1517 and inherited the traditional Arab commercial interests in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, too contested Portuguese power in the Gulf. The Safavid Persian Empire, which had unified Persia under the Shia Muslim Safavid dynasty from 1501 onward, was an expanding regional power that resented the Portuguese presence at Hormuz. The alliance that eventually ended Portuguese control of Hormuz is one of the more unusual partnerships in the history of the region. The Safavid Persian Empire and the English East India Company fighting together against Portugal in 1622. The English were not in the Gulf for humanitarian reasons. They were there because the East India Company had identified Persian silk, produced in enormous quantities in northern Iran, as a hugely profitable commodity for the European market, and because the Portuguese were charging duties on the silk trade that the English wanted to avoid. The Battle of Hormuz in 1622 was the result, a combined Anglo-Persian naval attack on the Portuguese fort and fleet. Portugal's garrison was overwhelmed. The Portuguese were expelled from Hormuz after more than a century of control. The fort fell, and the island became part of the Safavid Persian Empire. But English involvement in the Gulf didn't end with the defeat of Portugal. It deepened. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company established an increasing presence in the Gulf, competing with the Dutch, the Omanis, and various Arab coastal powers for commercial dominance. The Gulf was on the route to India, and India was the crown jewel of the emerging British commercial empire. Protecting that route meant controlling the Gulf. Controlling the Gulf meant, inevitably, dealing with the Strait of Hormuz. By the early 19th century, British India had effectively become the dominant political power in the Persian Gulf. a series of treaties with the Arab coastal states, agreements that the British called the Trucial System, from which the modern UAE's constituent states are called the Trucial States, gave Britain effective suzerainty over the southern shore of the Gulf in exchange for British protection against piracy and against Ottoman or Persian interference. Britain also signed treaties with the Sultanate of Oman, which controlled the Musandam Peninsula, the Omani territory that forms the southern jaw of the Strait of Hormuz. Oman's relationship with Britain was, and to some extent remains, one of the most important bilateral relationships in the Gulf, and its foundation was exactly this. Oman's geographic position at the entrance to the strait made it a crucial strategic partner for any naval power that wanted to influence the Gulf. For 150 years, from roughly 1820 to 1971, Britain was the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. It mediated disputes between the Gulf states. It suppressed what it called piracy, often in practice the suppression of Arab commercial competition with the East India Company. It maintained the stability of the Gulf's oil fields as they began to develop in the early 20th century, and it protected the Strait of Hormuz from any threat that might disrupt the flow of commerce to and from British India. When Britain announced in 1968 that it would withdraw east of Suez, the strategic retraction that ended Britain's global military commitments, the question of who would fill the power vacuum in the Gulf immediately became the central strategic problem of the region. The answer that emerged, with encouragement from the United States, was that Iran, then ruled by the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would be the region's dominant power and the Gulf's policeman. That arrangement lasted exactly 10 years. Oil was first commercially discovered in Persia in 1908 at a place called Masjid Soliman in the southwestern Iranian province of Khuzestan. The British-controlled Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would eventually become BP, began pumping almost immediately. Kuwait in 1938, Saudi Arabia in 1938, Qatar in 1940, Abu Dhabi in 1958. These are the discovery dates of the oil fields that would transform the Persian Gulf from a regional backwater into the most strategically critical piece of real estate on Earth. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Saudi Arabia alone holds approximately 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. Iraq holds another 9%, Iran approximately 9%. The UAE and Kuwait add further substantial reserves. The countries ringing the Persian Gulf collectively hold somewhere between 40 and 50% of the world's proven conventional oil reserves. All of it, virtually all of it, can only be exported through the Strait of Hormuz. The scale of the tanker traffic that developed through the strait from the 1950s onward is staggering. By the 1970s, supertankers, vessels of a scale never previously seen in maritime history, capable of carrying 3 million barrels of oil in a single voyage, were transiting the strait daily. The technology of the Very Large Crude Carrier, or VLCC, was specifically developed for the Gulf-to-markets trade, because the volumes involved required ships larger than anything previously imagined. A loaded VLCC weighs approximately 300,000 tons. It takes kilometers to stop at full speed. It cannot maneuver quickly. It is, in maritime terms, a city block of fragile metal containing an enormous quantity of flammable liquid moving slowly through a narrow passage flanked by potentially hostile coastlines. This is the vessel type that the modern Strait of Hormuz was built around, and the question of how to keep these vessels safe from attack, from accident, from political interference, became one of the central strategic preoccupations of the 20th century's great powers. The 1973 Arab oil embargo, when OPEC's Arab members cut production and embargoed oil to the United States and other Western nations in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, demonstrated for the first time and with sudden clarity what the disruption of Gulf oil supplies meant to the global economy. Petrol queues stretched around city blocks in the United States. European governments introduced Sunday driving bans. The global economy went into recession. And all the oil that caused that crisis had passed through the Strait of Hormuz. After 1973, the strategic importance of the strait was no longer academic. It was existential, at least in economic terms. The United States, which had until then been more interested in the Gulf than its European allies, but had left the management of Gulf security largely to Britain, began systematically building the naval infrastructure to dominate the strait and the Gulf beyond it. The American approach was codified in 1980 by President Jimmy Carter, responding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in what became known as the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine stated explicitly that any attempt by an outside force to control the Persian Gulf would be considered an attack on the vital interests of the United States and would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. This was, in essence, the United States formally declaring the Strait of Hormuz a zone of American strategic interest. It has been American policy ever since, maintained by every president from Carter to Biden. September 22, 1980. Iraqi forces crossed the border into Iran. Saddam Hussein, calculating that the political chaos of the Iranian Revolution has left Iran militarily vulnerable, launches a full-scale invasion. He is wrong about the vulnerability. The Iran-Iraq War lasts 8 years, kills somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, and produces one of the most underappreciated crises in the history of the Strait of Hormuz, the Tanker War. The Tanker War began in 1984, 4 years into the Iran-Iraq conflict, when both sides began attacking oil tankers in the Gulf. Iraq attacked tankers carrying Iranian oil, Iran's primary source of war revenue. Iran retaliated by attacking tankers serving the Arab Gulf states that were financing Iraq, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The attacks were relentless. Between 1984 and 1988, approximately 500 commercial vessels were attacked in the Gulf. Ships were struck by Exocet missiles, sea mines, gunboats, and artillery. Oil tankers burned in the waters of the Gulf. Sailors died. Insurance rates for Gulf shipping skyrocketed. The shipping companies of the world faced a simple question: was the oil trade worth the risk? Here's where things get dangerous. In 1987, Kuwait asked the United States to reflag its tankers to fly the American flag, thereby bringing them under U.S. military protection. Reagan agreed. The operation that followed, Operation Earnest Will, was the largest U.S. naval convoy operation since World War II. American warships began escorting Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf. The implicit warning to Iran was clear: attack these ships, and you are attacking the United States. But Iran, under the pressure of the war, and convinced that the U.S. was effectively fighting on Iraq's side anyway, was not reliably deterred. On April 14, 1988, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, an American frigate, struck an Iranian mine in the Gulf and was nearly sunk. The United States responded 4 days later with Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II. American warships destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms being used as military command posts, sank 2 Iranian frigates, and destroyed several other Iranian vessels. Iran lost more naval power in a single day than it had in the entire previous 8 years of the war. 2 months later, on July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American cruiser, shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Strait of Hormuz, killing all 290 civilians aboard. The U.S. military initially misidentified the aircraft as an attacking military plane. The incident remains one of the most controversial in the history of American military operations in the Gulf, and its memory has shaped Iranian perceptions of American intentions in the region ever since. The tanker war ended when the Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988, but the U.S. military presence in the Gulf did not. It had been institutionalized. The United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, became the permanent guarantor of Gulf shipping security and the permanent manifestation of American strategic commitment to keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. The 1990–91 Gulf War added another dimension to the Hormuz story. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the response, a 34-nation coalition under American leadership, was partly motivated by the specific threat that Iraqi control of Kuwait posed to the Gulf oil supply. An Iraq that controlled Kuwait would control approximately 20% of the world's oil reserves. An Iraq that then moved into Saudi Arabia, which many in the coalition feared, would control roughly 40%. The economic consequences flowing through the Strait of Hormuz would have been catastrophic. The Gulf War was, among other things, a war fought to keep the oil flowing through Hormuz. When President George H.W. Bush framed the war in terms of economic security and access to Gulf energy, he was being more honest than most political leaders usually are about the connection between military force and resource control. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which came to power in the 1979 revolution and which has been in a state of sustained tension with the United States ever since, has a complex relationship with the Strait of Hormuz that goes beyond simple threats to close it. Iran's strategic doctrine regarding Hormuz is sometimes called defensive deterrence. The logic runs like this. Iran cannot defeat the United States in a conventional naval engagement. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, the aircraft carriers that regularly operate in the Gulf, the American air bases in the UAE and Qatar and Bahrain, these represent a military superiority that Iran cannot match. But Iran doesn't need to match it. Iran needs only to make the cost of any American attack on Iran unacceptably high. And the lever Iran holds is Hormuz. The threat, explicit and repeated by Iranian officials, including Revolutionary Guards commanders and senior political figures, is that if Iran's interests are sufficiently threatened, Iran will close the strait, cutting the global oil supply and inflicting economic damage on the entire world. Is this credible? To an extent. Iran has significant capacity to disrupt strait traffic without blocking it entirely. It has an arsenal of anti-ship missiles positioned on its Gulf coast and on islands in the strait, including Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tunb Islands, which Iran seized from the UAE in 1971 and which remain a source of territorial dispute. It has a fleet of fast attack boats and submarines designed for Gulf operations. It has sea mines, and it has the ability to conduct asymmetric harassment operations, attacking individual vessels, boarding others, that can create commercial disruption without direct confrontation with the U.S. Navy. The incidents of the past 2 decades illustrate exactly this harassment doctrine at work. In 2007, Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval forces seized 15 British sailors and Marines from HMS Cornwall who were operating in disputed waters near the Shatt al-Arab estuary. They were held for 13 days and paraded on Iranian television before being released. A calculated demonstration of Iranian willingness to use force in the Gulf that stopped short of provoking a direct military response. In 2019, a series of attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, attributed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the UK to Iran, denied by Tehran, damaged multiple vessels using limpet mines attached to hulls below the waterline. The attacks were precisely calibrated, serious enough to raise insurance costs and create commercial uncertainty, not serious enough to sink ships and trigger a direct military response. In 2021, Iranian-backed forces launched a drone attack on the Mercer Strait, an Israeli-operated tanker, killing 2 crew members. In 2023, Iranian naval vessels seized 2 oil tankers in the Gulf. The Advantage Suite, owned by a company with U.S. connections, and the Suez Rajan. In 2024, the IRGC seized the MSC Ares, a container ship linked to an Israeli billionaire, as tensions over the Gaza conflict escalated. These are not random acts of piracy. They are calculated steps in a strategic campaign of controlled pressure, Iran demonstrating its capability to disrupt shipping without triggering the response that an all-out closure attempt would invite. And throughout all of this, the oil keeps flowing, because that's the other side of the Iranian calculus. Oil revenue, including Iran's own oil exports when sanctions permit, also passes through Hormuz. Closing the strait doesn't just hurt Iran's enemies, it hurts Iran. Let's talk numbers, because numbers are what make the Strait of Hormuz genuinely frightening in the modern context. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil and condensate transit the strait daily, as of the most recent reliable estimates. In a world consuming roughly 100 million barrels per day, and that's about 21% of global supply. But the regional breakdown is even more striking than the global figure. Japan imports approximately 90% of its oil from the Middle East, essentially all of it through Hormuz. South Korea imports roughly 70% from the region. China, the world's largest oil importer and second-largest economy, gets approximately 40% of its oil imports from the Gulf, all through Hormuz. India, the world's third-largest oil consumer, depends heavily on Gulf imports. For these major Asian economies, Hormuz is not one of several supply routes, it is the supply route. The liquid natural gas picture is even more concentrated. Qatar, which exports approximately 77 million tons of LNG per year, and making it consistently the world's largest or second-largest LNG exporter, ships virtually all of it through the Strait of Hormuz to customers in Europe and Asia. Qatar's North Field, which it shares with Iran's South Pars Field, is the largest natural gas field in the world. The LNG. It produces heats homes in Germany, powers factories in Japan, and generates electricity in Taiwan. All of it passes through 33 kilometers of contested water. The major exporters whose revenues depend on Hormuz represent a cross-section of the Gulf's political complexity. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 6 to 7 million barrels per day. Despite the Petroline pipeline to the Red Sea, the overwhelming majority still goes through Hormuz. The kingdom's entire fiscal model, the welfare spending, the subsidies, the megaprojects like NEOM, depends on those revenues. Iran, when not under maximal sanctions, exports 1 to 2 million barrels per day through Hormuz. The paradox of Iranian threats to close the strait is precisely this. Iran's own economy depends on the strait remaining open. Closing Hormuz would cost Iran billions of dollars in lost oil revenue at the exact moment it was imposing economic pain on its adversaries. The UAE has a particular vulnerability. Dubai's economy, the finance, tourism, and logistics hub that represents the Gulf's most diversified success story, depends not only on oil revenues, but on the continued functioning of the port of Jebel Ali, the largest port in the region, which handles goods for the entire Gulf. Disruption of Hormuz would affect not just Dubai's oil revenues, but its entire trade-based economy. Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain face similar existential dependencies. The Gulf states are, with limited exceptions, almost entirely dependent on a single export route that runs through a passage adjacent to the territory of a state that has repeatedly threatened to close it. The infrastructure around the strait is itself a critical vulnerability that is rarely discussed publicly. The strait is not just a shipping lane, it is surrounded by terminals, pipelines, storage facilities, and processing plants whose damage or destruction would compound the impact of any strait closure many times over. The Ras Tanura terminal in Saudi Arabia, the largest oil export terminal in the world, handling approximately 6 million barrels per day, sits on the Saudi Gulf coast. The Karg Island terminal in Iran, handling the bulk of Iranian oil exports, sits in the Gulf itself. The various LNG terminals of Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai are all Gulf assets requiring Hormuz access. An attack that damaged or destroyed any of these terminals, independent of any closure of the strait itself, would remove significant production capacity from the global market for months or years. The infrastructure that makes the oil and gas exportable is a vulnerability that the shipping lane alone understates. The global economic consequences of a significant Hormuz disruption have been modeled extensively by economists, energy analysts, and military planners. The consensus picture is roughly this. A 2-week complete closure would add somewhere between $50 and $100 to the price of a barrel of oil. A month-long closure could add $150 or more. The consequent inflation, economic contraction, and geopolitical instability would be experienced in every economy on Earth, but most severely in the import-dependent economies of Asia and Europe. In a world already managing inflation, supply chain disruption, and geopolitical stress, a Hormuz crisis would be the economic equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane hitting the global financial system. The question gets asked every time Iran threatens to close the strait, every time there's an incident in the Gulf, every time oil prices spike. Could Iran actually close the Strait of Hormuz? The honest answer is yes, temporarily, no, permanently, and the difference between those two answers matters enormously. Let's start with what Iran can do. Iran has developed over the past 4 decades a specific military capability designed for exactly this scenario, the capacity to impose significant costs on strait traffic without directly engaging the American naval forces that would respond to any full closure attempt. Iran's arsenal: anti-ship missiles, including the domestically produced Noor and Qadr missiles, with ranges sufficient to reach targets throughout the strait and the southern Gulf. Iran has positioned these on its coast, on Gulf islands, and on mobile platforms that are difficult to preemptively destroy. Iran's submarine fleet, 3 Kilo-class Russian submarines and numerous midget submarines and SEAL delivery vehicles, can operate in Gulf waters with some effectiveness, laying mines and conducting covert attack operations. The IRGC Navy's fast attack craft, hundreds of small, heavily armed speedboats capable of swarming tactics, have been specifically designed to overwhelm the defensive systems of larger naval vessels through sheer numbers. Iran has an extensive sea mine inventory, and the Persian Gulf's relatively shallow depth makes mine-laying an effective denial tactic. A coordinated mine-laying operation could take weeks to fully clear. Here's where things get complicated. In a full confrontation, the U.S. military's response capability is formidable. The U.S. Fifth Fleet has a permanent presence in the Gulf, headquartered in Bahrain. American carrier strike groups have operated in the Gulf region consistently since the 1990s. The U.S. has access to air bases in the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain from which strike aircraft can operate. The U.S. Navy's mine countermeasure capability, though limited, is specifically designed for Gulf operations. In a direct military contest, Iran's Navy would not survive engagement with the U.S. Fifth Fleet. This is not a controversial assessment. Iranian military planners know it perfectly well. The IRGC's strategy is not to defeat the U.S. Navy in conventional combat. It is to make the cost of operating in the Gulf, in casualties, in ship damage, in political pressure, in oil market disruption, high enough that American political will weakens. The specific scenario that military analysts consider most plausible is not a full closure, but a controlled disruption. Iran attacking individual vessels, laying mines in specific areas, and threatening further action, while stopping short of the full closure that would trigger maximum American military response. This is essentially the strategy Iran has been demonstrating for years with its harassment operations. This controlled disruption scenario could add $30 to $50 to the price of oil per barrel without triggering a full military response. It could drive commercial shipping companies to reroute, at enormous cost and with significant delays, through alternative routes like the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery times. It could cause the global LNG market to seize up as buyers scrambled for alternative supply. And it could demonstrate Iranian resolve to a domestic audience without crossing the red lines that would bring American military power fully to bear. The pipeline alternatives deserve a serious assessment because they're often mentioned as the solution to Hormuz vulnerability. The Saudi Petroline pipeline runs 1,200 kilometers from the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, with a capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline runs from the Abu Dhabi oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, with a capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day. Iraq has discussed, though not yet built, a pipeline to the Turkish Mediterranean coast or to the Jordanian Red Sea port of Aqaba. Collectively, these existing and potential bypass routes could, at maximum capacity, handle perhaps 7 to 8 million barrels per day. Against the 21 million barrels that normally transit Hormuz, this is a reduction of roughly two-thirds. The price impact of a 13 million barrel daily shortfall in global supply would be severe. The other factor that complicates the bypass picture: bypassing Hormuz doesn't help Qatar's LNG exports at all. Qatar's LNG terminals are in the Gulf. There is no pipeline equivalent for LNG of the scale that Qatar exports. If Hormuz closes, Qatar's LNG exports stop. Period. The realistic assessment, then, is this: a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz for any extended period is extremely unlikely because the costs to everyone, including Iran, are too high. But a partial disruption, lasting days to weeks, is eminently possible and has happened repeatedly. And even a partial disruption, at the scale of trade flowing through Hormuz, has global economic consequences. The Strait of Hormuz is the most fragile critical infrastructure on Earth. Not because it's easy to close, but because the consequences of even a partial disruption are so severe that the mere threat of disruption gives the country adjacent to it extraordinary leverage over the global economy. For 5,000 years, empires have fought over this narrow passage. The Sumerians built their trade networks through it. The Achaemenid Persians controlled it. Alexander the Great tried to seize it. The Arab merchants made it the hub of the medieval world's most sophisticated commercial network. The Portuguese fortified it. The British pacified it. The Americans declared it a vital national interest and stationed a fleet there to prove it. And through all of that, through conquest and trade, through revolution and war, through the age of sail and the age of steam and the age of the supertanker, the ships have kept moving. The oil has kept flowing. But here's the thing about 5,000 years of history. It doesn't make the future safe. If anything, the history of the Strait of Hormuz tells us something uncomfortable about the nature of strategic choke points. They don't become less important over time, they become more important. The oil age that made Hormuz the world's most critical waterway is not ending tomorrow. Despite the global energy transition, despite the growth of solar, wind, and electric vehicles, global oil demand is projected to remain above current levels through at least 2030, and possibly through 2040. The Gulf's share of global oil production is not declining. If anything, as higher-cost producers elsewhere reduce output in response to market pressure, the Gulf's low-cost production becomes proportionally more important. Meanwhile, the political tensions in the region are not easing. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, partly theological, partly geopolitical, entirely real, continues to shape every interaction in the Gulf. The Iranian nuclear program remains unresolved, with a dormant JCPOA agreement and ongoing uncertainty about whether Iran is building toward a nuclear weapons capability. The IRGC's regional operations in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza continue to create flashpoints that can escalate unexpectedly. And behind all of it, the specific geography has not changed. The strait is still 33 kilometers wide. The shipping lanes are still 3 kilometers wide. Iran's coastline still flanks the outbound lane. The islands of Abu Musa and the Tunbs are still Iranian-controlled and still disputed. The question that the history of Hormuz really raises is not, will the strait close? It's something harder. How did the world allow itself to become this dependent on a single, vulnerable, politically contested corridor of water? The answer, of course, is economics. The Persian Gulf's oil is cheap to produce, some of the lowest extraction costs in the world. Routing it through Hormuz is cheap and fast. The global energy system optimized for cost and efficiency over decades, and the result was a global economy that runs on a choke point that any one of several regional actors can threaten. Diversification of energy sources, of supply routes, of strategic reserves is the rational response. And it's happening. The U.S. achieved energy independence through shale production. Europe is scrambling to reduce dependence on imported gas after 2022. The growth of renewable energy is slowly, very slowly, reducing the share of global energy demand that must be met with oil and gas. But these transitions take decades, not years. And in the meantime, the Strait of Hormuz remains. Every day the tankers move, the oil flows. The global economy continues to function, dependent on a narrow passage between Iran and Oman that has been the most important stretch of water in the world for 5,000 years. In a world still running on oil, the Strait of Hormuz is its most fragile lifeline. It is not a problem that will be solved by diplomacy alone, or by military force alone, or by technology alone. It is a structural feature of the world we have built, as durable and as dangerous as the geography that created it. The question is not whether Hormuz matters, It is whether the world can afford to keep pretending that its vulnerability is someone else's problem. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about global energy, global security, or global history, subscribe to my channel. We do this for every story that shapes the world you live in.